The stars had never seemed so close until humanity finally cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel in the year 2347. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and watched the impossible become routine as his ship slipped through the fabric of space itself, covering distances that would have taken generations in mere hours. He was a practical man in his early 40s with graying hair and steady hands, chosen to lead humanity's first deep space exploration mission, not because he was the bravest or the smartest, but because he never panicked and always thought 3 steps ahead. The mission was simple enough on paper: survey the systems beyond Proxima Centauri, map potential colony sites, and prove that humanity belonged among the stars. For 6 months they had done exactly that, cataloging worlds and moons and finding nothing but empty space and silent planets. Then everything changed on a Tuesday morning when their sensors detected something that definitely was not. Natural Commander Lisa Rodriguez was the first to spot it, during her shift monitoring the long-range scanners. She was younger than Morrison by a decade, sharp-minded and quick with calculations, the kind of officer who could spot a problem before it became a crisis. The object on her screen was massive, easily 10 times the size of their ship, and it was broadcasting signals across every frequency imaginable. She called Morrison to the bridge immediately, and together they stared at humanity's first proof that they were not alone in the universe. The structure hung in space like a geometric flower made of metal and crystal, pulsing with lights that seemed to follow patterns too complex to be accidental. Morrison gave the order to approach slowly, while Rodriguez worked on decoding the signals. Neither of them noticed how their hands were shaking until later. The station seemed to notice them as they drew closer. The pulsing lights changed pattern, and suddenly, a beam of pure information hit their communication systems, overwhelming every buffer and safety protocol they had. The ship's computer screamed warnings as data flooded in faster than it could process. Then just as suddenly it stopped and the main view screen flickered to life, showing something that made Morrison's breath catch in his throat. The being on the screen was tall and crystalline, its body reflecting light in ways that hurt to look at directly. And when it spoke, the words came through in perfect English, somehow translated in real time. It called itself High Arbiter Jathic, and it spoke with the tone of someone addressing a child or perhaps an insect. The Arbiter explained that this was a relay station belonging to the Galactic Council, an organization of 847 species that had governed this region of space for over 50,000 years. Humanity had been observed, it said, and evaluated and found wanting. Morrison felt his stomach drop as Jathic continued speaking. The Council had watched Earth's first clumsy attempts at FTL travel and seen enough to make their judgment. Humans were primitive and dangerous, warlike and unsophisticated, lacking the cultural refinement and technological advancement necessary for true galactic citizenship. The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered with complete indifference, as if Jathic was reading from a script it had used 1,000 times before. Rodriguez pulled up a recorder and made sure every word was being captured. Something in her gut told her this message would be the most important thing humanity had ever heard. The ultimatum came next, and it was delivered with the same casual tone one might use to discuss the weather. Humanity would pay an annual tribute to the Galactic Council, consisting of raw resources, technological samples, and genetic material from their population. In exchange, the Council would graciously allow humanity to continue existing under their protection. The alternative was quarantine, a complete lockdown of human space enforced by automated defense platforms that would destroy any vessel attempting to leave. Jathic explained this as if offering a generous gift, as if humanity should be grateful for the opportunity to serve. The tribute would begin in 1 Earth year and continue indefinitely. The Council expected full compliance and had never encountered a species foolish enough to refuse their protection. Jathic's crystalline face showed something that might have been a smile as it waited for Morrison's response. Morrison looked at Rodriguez and saw his own anger reflected in her eyes. Every instinct screamed at him to tell this arrogant being exactly where it could shove its protection. But he was a ship captain, not a diplomat, and this decision was far too big for one person to make. He took a slow breath and chose his words carefully. He told Jathic that humanity would need time to consider the Council's generous offer and deliver a proper response. The Arbiter seemed pleased with this answer, clearly interpreting Morrison's restraint as the beginning of submission. It reminded them once more that they had 1 year before the first tribute payment was due. Then the transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun. The view screen went dark, and the relay station's lights returned to their original pattern, completely ignoring the small human ship floating nearby. Morrison stood in silence for a long moment before turning to Rodriguez. His voice was quiet but firm as he gave the order to record everything they had seen and set course for Earth at maximum speed. Rodriguez nodded and relayed the commands while Morrison walked to his ready room and sat down heavily in his chair. He pulled up the recording of Jathik's message and watched it again, studying every word and gesture. The being had been so certain, so completely confident that humanity would bow to their demands. It had probably given this same speech to dozens or hundreds of other species over its long lifetime. Morrison wondered how many of them had agreed immediately out of fear. He wondered how many had fought and lost. Most of all, he wondered what humanity would choose when they heard this message. The horizon's edge burned through space toward home, carrying news that would change everything. Morrison sent the recording ahead via FTL communication buoy, knowing it would reach Earth days before they did. He imagined the chaos it would cause, the fear and anger and desperate debate. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he had already made his own choice about what humanity's answer should be. He suspected Rodriguez had too, and probably most of his crew. But it did not matter what they thought. This decision belonged to Earth, to all of humanity together. All Morrison could do was deliver the message and hope that the people back home remembered who they were and what they stood for. He looked out at the stars rushing past and prayed that when the time came to answer, humanity would choose to stand rather than kneel. The message from the horizon's edge reached Earth on a Wednesday afternoon, and within 6 hours every government on the planet had declared a state of emergency. President Helen Carter sat in the Oval Office watching the recording for the 7th time, studying the crystalline face of High Arbiter Jathik as it casually demanded humanity's submission. She was a former senator from Colorado who had won the presidency on promises of unity and progress, but nothing in her political career had prepared her for this moment. The United Earth Assembly convened an emergency session in Geneva, and representatives from every nation and colony gathered to decide humanity's fate. Carter knew that whatever choice they made in the coming weeks would echo through history forever. The debate began immediately, and it was fiercer than anything the Assembly had ever witnessed. Secretary General Marcus Webb stood before the gathered representatives and made the case for acceptance with cold logic and careful analysis. He was a diplomat who had spent 30 years negotiating treaties and preventing wars, a man who believed that survival always trumped pride. Webb presented detailed reports compiled by military analysts and technology experts showing the vast gap between human capabilities and council technology. Their surveillance network could monitor entire star systems simultaneously. Their weapons could crack planets open from orbit, and their youngest member species had been traveling faster than light for 3,000 years, while humanity had managed it for barely a decade. Webb's voice was steady as he explained that refusing the Council's demands would be suicide dressed up as bravery. He argued that humanity could accept the tribute, buy time to advance their technology, and perhaps renegotiate in a century or two when they were stronger. Pride was a luxury that extinct species could not afford. Admiral Richard Cole rose to speak next, and his response was immediate and fierce. He was a career military officer who had spent 40 years in the defense fleet, a man with gray hair and scars from the colony wars who had never backed down from a fight in his life. Cole reminded the Assembly of every moment in human history when people were told to kneel and chose to stand instead. He spoke of revolutions and rebellions, of colonists who left Earth seeking freedom and found it among the stars. He asked the representatives to imagine explaining to their children that humanity had traveled to the stars only to become servants to those who got there first. Cole's fist hit the podium as he declared that the Council's protection was just another word for slavery, and that a cage remained a cage no matter how gilded or how large. His voice carried to every corner of the chamber as he said that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed impossible. Dr. Patricia Long offered a different perspective that chilled everyone who heard it. She was Earth's leading xenobiologist, a woman who had spent her career studying the possibilities of alien life, and now she studied the reality with growing horror. Long presented her analysis of the Council's demands, and pointed out something that Webb and Cole had both missed in their focus on military and political concerns. The council wanted genetic samples from the human population, regular harvests of biological material that they would use for purposes unknown. Long showed historical patterns from Earth's own past when powerful groups demanded resources from weaker ones, and those resources eventually included people themselves. She warned that humanity might not be joining the galactic community as junior members, but as livestock, biological resources for species that viewed them as fundamentally inferior. Her voice shook as she explained that the council's language patterns showed contempt rather than respect, and that beings who felt contempt rarely treated their subjects well. A civilian representative named Daniel Price stood to speak, and the chamber fell silent. He was a former colony engineer who had helped build the settlements on Proxima Centauri, a man with calloused hands and a direct manner who represented the thousands of humans living beyond Earth. Price spoke simply and clearly about what freedom meant to the colonists who had left everything behind to build new lives among the stars. He described children born on Proxima who had never seen Earth, who played under an alien sun and dreamed of exploring even further into the galaxy. Price asked the assembly whether those children should grow up as citizens or subjects, whether they would own their future, or rent it from overlords who viewed them as primitives. He reminded everyone that humanity had not spent centuries reaching for the stars just to bow before those who arrived first. His final words were directed at Webb and the pragmatists who counseled acceptance. Price said that survival without dignity was not survival at all, but a slow death of everything that made humanity worth preserving. The debate continued for 3 weeks, and protests erupted across Earth and the colonies. Millions marched in the streets of every major city, some demanding acceptance for survival, and others demanding resistance for dignity. The assembly chamber became a battlefield of words and ideas, where every representative fought for what they believed was humanity's best path forward. Carter listened to every argument and read every report, knowing that the weight of this decision would rest on her shoulders regardless of how the vote went. She met with advisors late into the night, consulted with military commanders and civilian leaders, and tried to imagine the consequences of either choice. Accept and humanity might survive as subjects, refuse and they might die as free beings. The choice seemed impossible until Carter realized that she was asking the wrong question. Finally, Carter called for the vote that would determine humanity's future. The decision required a 2/3 majority of the assembly to pass. Representatives cast their votes in silence, each one knowing that history would judge them for this moment. The results came in slowly as votes were counted and verified. The chamber held its breath as the final tally was announced. By a margin of 68%, the assembly voted to refuse the council's demands. Humanity would not pay tribute, would not submit to protection, would not bow to beings who viewed them as inferior. The decision was made. Carter retreated to her office to draft humanity's official response to the Galactic Council. She spent hours writing and rewriting, crafting 17 pages of careful diplomatic language explaining humanity's position. She cited principles of sovereignty and self-determination, argued for negotiation between equals rather than submission between masters and subjects, and laid out detailed reasons why humanity could not accept the Council's terms. The document was thoughtful and thorough and completely inadequate for what she needed to say. Carter stared at her 17 pages and realized that Jothic would read it as weakness. As a primitive species trying to justify its defiance with words the Council would dismiss as irrelevant. Admiral Cole entered her office near midnight and found Carter surrounded by discarded drafts. He read her latest attempt and then made a suggestion that changed everything. Cole reminded her that the Council had made their position clear with simple language and absolute certainty. Humanity's response should be equally clear and equally certain. No explanations, no justifications, no diplomatic dancing around the truth. Just an answer that could not be misunderstood or misinterpreted. Carter looked at her 17 pages of careful reasoning and understood that Cole was right. She deleted everything she had written and started over with a document that contained a single word. The message was transmitted to the Council relay station exactly 1 year after Jothic's original ultimatum. It traveled faster than light across the vast distances between Earth and Convergence Prime, where the Galactic Council waited for humanity's grateful acceptance. The message contained no preamble, no explanation, no attempt to soften or justify what it said. President Helen Carter had reduced humanity's response to its essence, one word that carried the weight of centuries of human struggle for freedom and dignity. The word was simple and clear and absolute: no. The message arrived at Convergence Prime during a routine session of the Galactic Council and changed everything in an instant. High Arbiter Jathic stood before 10,000 representatives from hundreds of species in the Grand Chamber, where every major decision of the past 50 millennia had been made. The chamber was a marvel of engineering and art, a vast amphitheater carved from living crystal that could display information directly into the consciousness of every being present. Jathic had presented tribute acceptances from primitive species countless times before, and expected this moment to be no different. The crystalline being activated the display matrix with casual confidence, and humanity's response appeared simultaneously on holographic screens, neural interfaces, and thought projection fields throughout the chamber. Every delegate saw the same thing at the same moment: a single word in humanity's primary language with translations appearing in every known form of communication. The word was short and simple and completely unprecedented. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Ambassador Krelix of the Morthian Collective physically recoiled from his display as if the word itself had struck him. The Morthians were an ancient species that had joined the Council 12,000 years ago, and Krelix had never seen any species refuse tribute in his 3 centuries of service. Councillor Vara of the Selnari Empire began making a sound that her species only produced when confronted with something cosmically absurd, a harsh clicking that echoed through the chamber. The Selnari had conquered half a galaxy before joining the Council, and Vara had personally overseen the subjugation of 17 species. But none had ever simply said no without explanation or justification or plea for mercy. Around the chamber, representatives rose from their seats, gestured wildly with appendages of every description, and demanded explanations in hundreds of languages that the translation matrix struggled to keep up with. Jathic stood frozen at the center of the chaos, trying to process what had happened. In the Council's entire 50,000-year history, no species had ever refused their offer of protection. Some had negotiated for better terms and delayed their acceptance. Some had requested more time to prepare their populations. A few had even attempted military resistance before reality forced them to accept the inevitable. But none had simply refused without explanation, without counterproposal, without any acknowledgement that the Council's power made refusal meaningless. The closest historical comparison was the Kresh Rebellion, a species that fought for 30 years before finally accepting vassalage. But even the Kresh had explained their position and offered alternatives and tried to find compromise. The humans did none of these things. They simply said no as if that single word was sufficient answer to the greatest power in the galaxy. The Council's chief historian, a being named Quelm, whose species measured time in geological epochs, accessed the archives searching for precedent. Quelm's report only deepened the mystery. Every species that had encountered the Council fell into predictable patterns. The aggressive ones fought briefly before surrendering. The diplomatic ones negotiated terms before accepting. The fearful ones submitted immediately. But the humans did not fit any pattern. They offered no explanation for their refusal, made no threats, issued no counterdemands. They simply said no and apparently expected that to be enough. Quelm noted in his report that such behavior suggested either complete ignorance of the Council's power or complete indifference to it, and neither option made sense for a species that had just achieved FTL travel. High Arbiter Jathic finally restored order to the chamber and made the decision to interpret humanity's response as ignorance rather than defiance. Surely the humans did not understand the consequences of their refusal. Their primitive technology probably could not properly convey the full weight of what quarantine meant. Jathic drafted a second message to Earth, this time with detailed projections and simulations showing exactly what would happen if humanity continued to refuse. The message included economic models demonstrating how isolation would collapse their trade networks, technological analyses showing how they would stagnate without access to Council knowledge, and population studies predicting eventual extinction as resources dwindled within their prison. Jathic made the message as clear and detailed as possible, giving humanity one more chance to reconsider their foolish decision. The Arbiter sent the message with genuine confidence that the humans would recognize their mistake and submit properly. On Earth, President Helen Carter received the Council's second message and forwarded it to Admiral Richard Cole with 2 words attached. Cole read the Council's dire predictions and detailed threats and felt something close to satisfaction. The Council was afraid. They would not bother with a second message if humanity's refusal had not shaken them. Cole forwarded the message to every military installation in human space along with a single command that had been prepared months ago. The command was simple and absolute. Start building. The mobilization began immediately across every human world and station. On Earth, shipyards that had been constructing colony vessels and cargo haulers switched to military production. Factories on Luna that produced consumer goods retooled their assembly lines for weapon systems and armor plating. Mars diverted its massive terraforming operations to manufacturing, using the same equipment that was meant to make the planet livable to instead produce missiles and defense platforms. The Proxima Centauri colony, barely 5 years old and furthest from Earth, sent volunteer crews and raw materials back toward the core systems, despite knowing they would be the most vulnerable when the Council came. Every human installation from the oldest stations in Earth orbit to the newest outposts on the frontier contributed everything they could to the coming war. Dr. Patricia long led a scientific team studying every scrap of data humanity had collected from the Council relay station. Her team worked around the clock analyzing the technology that had broadcast Jothic's message, looking for weaknesses or vulnerabilities or any advantage humanity could exploit. The news was not encouraging. Council technology was centuries beyond humanity's in almost every field. Their power generation was more efficient, their materials were stronger, their computers were faster, and their weapons were devastatingly more powerful. Long's report to President Carter was blunt and honest. In a straight fight, humanity would lose quickly and completely. The only question was how much damage they could do before the end. But then civilian engineer Daniel Price made an observation that changed everyone's calculations. Price had been studying not just the Council's technology, but their behavior and patterns. He noted that Council technology was indeed more advanced, but it was also standardized and predictable. Every system followed established protocols that had been refined over thousands of years. The Council had optimized their technology for efficiency and compliance, building tools designed to manage an empire where resistance was unthinkable. Price pointed out that the Council had not fought a real war in millennia. They had conducted pacification campaigns against primitive species and suppressed occasional rebellions, but they had not faced an enemy that refused to surrender and adapted tactics to exploit weaknesses. The Council had forgotten how to fight because they had not needed to for so long. Humanity remembered. Captain Jake Morrison volunteered to lead the first strike wing and began training crews in tactics that would have been considered suicidal under normal circumstances. Commander Lisa Rodriguez developed engagement protocols based on asymmetric warfare, studying every guerrilla campaign and resistance movement in human history. They planned to make every encounter cost the Council more than they expected, to turn humanity's disadvantages into advantages through unpredictability and willingness to take risks that no sane commander would accept. If the Council expected a conventional war, they would get something else entirely. President Carter sent one final message to the Galactic Council before the deadline for tribute expired. This message was longer than humanity's first response, but much shorter than her original 17-page draft. Carter wrote 3 sentences that laid out humanity's position with absolute clarity. The message read as follows: "We said no, we meant it. Come and try to make us change our minds." Carter sent the message and then addressed the people of Earth and the colonies in a broadcast that was watched by every human alive. She told them that war was coming and that humanity would likely lose. She told them that the choice had been made anyway because some things mattered more than survival. She told them to remember who they were and what they fought for. And then she gave the order for the defense fleet to prepare for battle. The Galactic Council voted to enforce the quarantine with overwhelming force. They dispatched the 3rd Enforcement Fleet, 500 vessels under the command of Fleet Marshal Doran of the Telmarine Sovereignty. Doran was a decorated officer who had overseen pacification campaigns against 14 primitive species over his long career. He viewed this assignment as a formality, a minor task to remind one more primitive species of their place in the galactic order. Doran's fleet entered human space expecting to broadcast the standard surrender demands, fire a few warning shots, and watch the humans submit like every other species had done. His confidence was absolute as his sensors detected the human defense fleet waiting near Earth. He saw their primitive vessels with their crude weapons and outdated designs and felt something close to pity. This would be over quickly. Then the humans opened fire and Doran realized that nothing about this campaign would be routine. The 3rd Enforcement Fleet entered the Sol system with 500 warships arranged in perfect formation. A display of power meant to crush any thought of resistance before the first shot was fired. Fleet Marshal Doran sat in his command chair aboard the flagship Eternal Dominance and watched the primitive human vessels appear on his tactical display. He counted fewer than 200 ships total, most of them converted cargo haulers and colony transports hastily fitted with weapons. Doran broadcast the standard demand for immediate surrender in every human language, expecting the response that always came when inferior species faced the reality of council power. Instead, his communication officer reported that the humans were accelerating toward the fleet at maximum speed. Doran assumed this was a final gesture before surrender, some primitive display of courage before accepting the inevitable. He ordered his weapons officer to fire a warning shot across the lead human vessel to remind them of their place. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the lead ship, defiant, and watched the council's warning shot streak past his bow. His crew looked to him for orders, and Morrison gave them without hesitation. He told his helmsman to increase speed beyond safe limits and aim directly for the council flagship. His weapons officer asked if Morrison wanted to return fire, and the captain shook his head. Morrison had something better than weapons for this moment. He gave the order to release Payload Alpha and watched as the Defiant launched what appeared to be a dozen cargo containers tumbling through space. Doran's tactical officer reported the launch with confusion, unable to understand why the humans would jettison cargo during a battle. Then the containers activated their hidden engines and accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, transformed from harmless debris into kinetic missiles that no energy weapon could stop in time. The impacts hit the Eternal Dominance's forward shields with force that overwhelmed every calculation. Doran's ship had shields designed to absorb energy weapons and deflect conventional missiles, but nothing in Council doctrine prepared them for crude masses accelerated to relativistic speeds. The shield generators overloaded in cascading failure, and the flagship's entire forward defensive grid went dark. Doran sat stunned in his command chair as damage reports flooded in, unable to comprehend how primitive kinetics had accomplished what sophisticated weapons could not. Before he could issue new orders, Commander Lisa Rodriguez led the second wave through the gap Morrison had created. Her squadron of 30 ships targeted the exposed sensor arrays along the flagship's hull with concentrated fire. The Council's advanced targeting, systems that could track 1,000 threats simultaneously, went dark as their sensors shattered under the human assault. The battle descended into chaos that no Council fleet had experienced in centuries. Human ships deployed mines disguised as debris that activated when Council vessels passed too close. Small attack craft launched from hidden positions in the asteroid belt and struck at the fleet's flanks. Every human tactic violated accepted principles of civilized warfare, using ambush and deception and willingness to sacrifice ships for tactical advantage. Doran tried to restore order, but his flagship was half blind and his fleet scattered across the system. The engagement lasted 4 hours and cost humanity 30 ships destroyed with all hands lost. The Council lost 5 vessels, a ratio that should have been impossible, and Doran lost something more important than ships. He lost his certainty that this campaign would be simple. The war spread across human space like wildfire. On Proxima Centauri Colony Administrator Kevin Sharp organized civilians into militia units using mining equipment and construction tools as improvised weapons. When Council ground forces landed expecting frightened primitives, they found humans fighting for their homes with a ferocity that shocked the professional soldiers. Every building became a fortress, every street a killing ground, and every colonist a defender willing to die rather than surrender. The Council siege squadron found itself taking casualties from positions that should not exist, losing soldiers to traps and ambushes that violated every rule of proper warfare. Sharp broadcast reports back to Earth, showing that even the most vulnerable human settlements would make the Council pay for every meter of ground. On Mars, engineer Rachel Moore converted the massive terraforming equipment into weapons platforms. The same drills meant to tap into underground water became railguns launching projectiles at orbital velocities. The atmosphere processors designed to make Mars livable became jamming stations disrupting Council communications. Moore's improvised defenses could not stop the Council's siege squadron, but they made the blockade expensive, forcing the Council to commit ships and resources to contain a colony that should have surrendered immediately. Every day the Council spent besieging Mars was another day they were not advancing on Earth, and Moore made sure they spent many days paying a price that kept rising. Dr. Patricia Long made a breakthrough that changed the strategic situation. Working with captured Council technology from destroyed ships, her team discovered that the Council's faster-than-light communication system used a predictable quantum signature. Human ships began broadcasting jamming signals on those frequencies, disrupting the coordination that made Council fleets so effective. Suddenly, the superior Council vessels found themselves fighting as individuals rather than a unified force, unable to share targeting data or coordinate tactics. The technological advantage that made Council ships superior started to erode as human captains exploited the confusion with tactics that required no coordination at all, just courage and willingness to take risks. Admiral Richard Cole directed the overall defense from his command center on Luna and turned every retreat into an ambush. When the Council took the outer colonies, Cole made sure they found nothing but empty buildings and booby traps. When Council forces advanced on fortified positions, Cole waited until they were committed, then struck from unexpected angles. The Council won every major engagement and advanced steadily toward Earth, but they bled ships and crew and time with every victory. Cole's strategy was simple and brutal: make the Council pay such a high price for conquest that continuing the war became more expensive than walking away. 3 months into the war, the Galactic Council gathered again on Convergence, primed to review the campaign progress. High Arbiter Jothic presented casualty reports that should not exist. The humans were losing every battle, but the Council had lost over 100 ships and thousands of crew members. The Third Enforcement Fleet was requesting reinforcements, and Fleet Marshal Doran warned that taking Earth itself might cost hundreds more vessels. Jothic tried to explain this as temporary setbacks, but Ambassador Krelix interrupted with a question that silenced the chamber. Krelix asked how much the Council was willing to spend to subjugate one primitive species that controlled a handful of systems. He pointed out that the war had already cost more in ships and resources than a century of tribute would provide. Counselor Vara of the Selnari Empire followed with her own analysis. She explained that the real cost was not military but political. Subject species across the Council's territory were watching humanity's resistance and asking dangerous questions. Tribute payments from a dozen vassal worlds had slowed or stopped entirely. 3 species had formally requested renegotiation of their agreements. The Council's authority had always rested on the belief that resistance was futile, but humanity was proving otherwise with every day they continued fighting. Vara made a cold calculation and presented it to the Council. Conquering humanity would cost more than leaving them alone, but the precedent of their successful resistance might cost even more in the long run. The Council authorized reinforcements and dispatched the 7th and 12th Enforcement Fleets to human space. They voted to escalate the campaign and finish this war quickly before more subject species got dangerous ideas. But privately, many Council members began discussing something that had not been seriously considered in thousands of years. They began discussing the possibility of negotiated withdrawal, of admitting that one primitive species was simply not worth the cost of conquest. These discussions remained secret for now, but the fact that they happened at all represented a crack in the Council's absolute authority. On Earth, President Helen Carter received Admiral Cole's latest strategic assessment. The defense fleet was down to 40% of its original strength. Mars had fallen to Council occupation. Proxima Colony was under siege with supplies running low. Earth herself had sustained 3 orbital bombardments that killed millions. The Council was requesting negotiations, but only to discuss terms of humanity's surrender. Carter gathered her advisors and asked for their recommendations. Daniel Price argued for seeking compromise, accepting some form of limited submission that preserved human lives if not freedom. Dr. Patricia Long warned that any agreement must protect humanity's sovereignty, or it would be meaningless. Admiral Cole said nothing at first, simply displaying the casualty lists on the screen. Thousands of names of people who died rather than kneel. Carter made her decision. She drafted humanity's response to the Council's negotiation request and made sure every word counted. The message acknowledged that humanity was losing the military conflict, but stated that defeat was not the same as surrender. Carter wrote that humanity would negotiate only as equals, not as subjects begging for mercy. Any peace agreement must recognize complete human independence with no tribute, no genetic sampling, and no council authority over human territory. She ended the message by reminding the council that humanity had proven they would rather die free than live as subjects, and that the council had to decide if exterminating humanity was really worth the cost. Carter sent the message and waited to see if the council would choose continued war or reluctant peace. The Galactic Council debated for 3 days straight in their grand chamber on Convergence Prime, while the war continued to drain resources and lives across human space. High Arbiter Jathic stood at the center, demanding that the campaign continue until humanity submitted completely. The Crystalline being argued that stopping now would show weakness and encourage other species to resist. Jathic insisted the humans were nearly broken, and one final push would bring the surrender that the Council required. Fleet Marshal Doran attended via holographic transmission, and his image flickered with interference from wounds he had sustained when another human suicide attack damaged his flagship. Doran told the Council a truth they did not want to hear. The humans would not break. They would die fighting and take as many Council ships with them as possible. Every battle proved that humanity valued freedom more than survival, and no amount of force would change that calculation. Ambassador Krelix presented economic reports that made even the most aggressive Council members pause. The war had cost more in 3 months than humanity's tribute would have provided in 3 centuries. Ship construction across the Council's territory could not keep pace with losses. Medical facilities overflowed with wounded crew members from species that had not experienced combat casualties in generations. Families of the dead were demanding answers from governments that had no experience explaining military losses. Krelix showed projections demonstrating that complete conquest of Earth would require at least 2 more years of fighting and cost thousands of additional ships. The economic burden was becoming unsustainable, and the political cost was rising even faster. The real crisis was spreading across Council territory like a virus. Councillor Vara of the Selnari Empire presented intelligence reports showing that subject species throughout the galaxy were watching humanity's resistance with growing interest. Tribute payments from 40 vassal worlds had slowed significantly. 12 species had formally requested renegotiation of their agreements. 3 had stopped paying tribute entirely, citing humanity's example as justification. Protest movements were forming on worlds that had been peaceful subjects for thousands of years. The Council's authority had always rested on the certainty that resistance was futile, but humanity was proving that determination mattered more than technology. Vara made her position clear. The Council could win the war against humanity, but lose their empire in the process. Every day the conflict continued was another day that other species learned they could say no. The vote came after heated arguments that nearly fractured the Council itself. Some members wanted total extermination of humanity as an example to others. Some wanted negotiated peace to stop the bleeding. Some wanted to continue the war but with limited objectives. Finally, Councillor Vara forced the decisive vote by presenting only 2 realistic options. The Council could escalate to complete extermination, revealing their brutality to every watching species and destroying any pretense of benevolent protection. Or they could negotiate genuine peace, accepting that one species had successfully resisted, and hoping that graceful withdrawal would cost less than stubborn pride. The vote was close enough that individual delegates made the difference. The Council chose negotiation. The terms arrived at Earth within days. President Helen Carter read them carefully with her full cabinet present. The Council offered humanity complete independence within their current territory. No tribute would be required, no genetic samples demanded, no council authority over human affairs. In exchange, humanity must agree not to expand beyond their current systems for 100 years. Trade would be permitted and diplomatic relations established, but humanity would remain isolated from the broader galactic community until the Council deemed them ready. Secretary General Marcus Webb called it victory and urged immediate acceptance. Admiral Richard Cole called it a larger cage and argued for demanding more. Dr. Patricia Long warned that accepting any restrictions set dangerous precedents. Captain Jake Morrison sent a private message to President Carter from his hospital bed on Luna, station where he was recovering from injuries. Sustained in the final battle for Earth's orbital space, Morrison reminded Carter of humanity's first response to the Council, that single word that started everything. He asked whether the Council's terms represented genuine respect or just temporary convenience. He pointed out that the Council was offering peace because humanity made war too expensive, not because they recognized human rights or dignity. Morrison wrote that accepting these terms would make humanity the exception that proved the rule, isolated and contained while the Council maintained authority over everyone else. His message ended with a simple question. What did no really mean if humanity accepted yes with conditions attached? Carter realized Morrison was right. She called an emergency session of the United Earth Assembly and laid out the situation with complete honesty. The Council was offering peace, but only peace that suited their interests. Accepting these terms meant humanity survived, but every other species remained enslaved. Carter asked the Assembly whether humanity had fought for their own freedom, or for the principle that no species should kneel to another. The debate was shorter this time because the answer was obvious once the question was properly framed. The Assembly voted to reject the Council's terms and present their own counter-proposal. The margin was even larger than the original vote to refuse tribute. President Carter drafted humanity's response with input from every faction that had argued during the original debate. She acknowledged the Council's offer, but presented humanity's own requirements for peace. Humanity would accept independence but not isolation. Humans would not expand militarily, but reserve the right to pursue diplomatic and trade relationships with any species willing. The Council must remove all blockade infrastructure immediately. Most importantly, humanity demanded that the Council extend the same offer to any other species that requested it. Any vassal world that wanted to renegotiate their status must be allowed to do so without punishment or retaliation. Carter's message explained that humanity did not fight just to save themselves. They fought because forced submission was wrong regardless of who was being forced. Peace required more than stopping the shooting. It required recognizing that no species should kneel to another. The Council received humanity's counter-proposal and the chamber erupted in anger. Ambassador Krelix called it insane that a defeated species was dictating terms. High Arbiter Zhadik demanded immediate rejection and resumption of the war, but Councillor Vera stood and spoke with cold logic that cut through the emotion. She explained that rejecting these terms meant continuing a war that was already too expensive. Every species in the galaxy was watching this negotiation. If the Council refused reasonable terms and resumed extermination campaigns, they would reveal themselves as tyrants rather than protectors. But accepting humanity's terms meant fundamentally changing how the Council governed the galaxy. Vara said the choice was simple. The Council could maintain their pride and lose their empire, or they could accept change and maintain their relevance. The vote was closer than anyone expected, but change won by a narrow margin. High Arbiter Zhadik made the announcement that would reshape galactic civilization. The Council accepted humanity's terms, including the provision that any species could request renegotiation of their tribute agreements. Furthermore, the Council declared a fundamental change in their governing philosophy. They would transition from overlords demanding submission to coordinators facilitating cooperation. Species would be partners by choice rather than subjects by force. The transformation would take time, and many Council members privately vowed to resist. But the decision was made and broadcast across every world in Council space. On Earth, the celebrations were muted because too many had died to make victory feel joyful. Captain Jake Morrison attended ceremonies honoring the fallen and wished he could trade every medal for just one of his dead crew members. Commander Lisa Rodriguez began training new officers for a future where humanity could explore freely. Dr. Patricia Long led research programs studying Council technology, but now as colleagues rather than enemies. Admiral Richard Cole retired knowing the defense fleet he built would protect explorers instead of rebels. Daniel Price returned to colony work building settlements that could grow without limits. Secretary General Marcus Webb worked on treaties ensuring the peace would last. President Helen Carter addressed humanity one final time before her term ended, reading the names of those who died defending a single word, and reminding everyone that freedom always costs something. 6 months after the war ended, an alien delegation arrived at Earth requesting asylum. They represented the Vareth, a species that had been Council vassals for 3,000 years. Their ambassador met privately with President Carter and asked how humanity found courage to refuse when species with millennia more experience had accepted submission. Carter thought about Jake Morrison attacking impossible odds, and Lisa Rodriguez fighting when defeat was certain. She thought about millions of humans who chose danger over safety. She considered the question carefully before answering. Humanity remembered that no was a complete sentence. That single word contained everything necessary. No explanation was required, no justification needed. Sometimes the most important thing you could say was the shortest thing you could say. The galaxy learned that lesson slowly. Across council space, other species began speaking the same word humanity had spoken. Some negotiated new agreements. Some declared complete independence. A few chose to maintain relationships with the council, but now as partners rather than subjects. The Galactic Council survived but transformed into what they had always claimed to be. A coalition of equals rather than a hierarchy of masters and vassals. The transformation was messy and complicated and sometimes chaotic, but it was also free. 50 years later, human ships explored far beyond their original boundaries. They encountered new species and shared the story of first contact, of one word that changed everything. Young aliens asked why humans risked extinction for independence when they could have lived safely as subjects. The humans explained that some things mattered more than safety, that dignity could not be purchased with surrender, that freedom was worth any price. They told the story of a single word and the war it started, of a species that refused to kneel even when kneeling seemed rational. The lesson spread across the galaxy slowly but inevitably. Sometimes the only word that mattered was no. Sometimes the right answer was the simplest answer. Sometimes when the entire universe expected you to kneel, the only response that preserved what made you worth preserving was to stand and speak that single word regardless of consequences. Humanity said no. The galaxy changed. Everything began with one word that meant everything.